Well, this silly thing works, but it doesn't. That's it. That's working now. Because I said it's a silly thing, you see. It works. That reading from Luke was very difficult to take in because it's only 2 short verses. And they're so stark. Jesus is warning his followers that men and women will hate them because of me. He tells them that even their families will betray them. And however, he then goes on to tell them that by standing firm, they will gain eternal life. Now, let me show you this. My daughter gave me this apron for Christmas. And I think it sums it up, the whole message of that up very beautifully. Here we are. Being a Christian is not always an easy job, but the retirement plans are amazing. I thought that was great. And that's the thing that keeps me going in the difficult times. That's the thing that keeps me going when it seems hard to continue living at, those times when we go through it at times. But the thought of coming face to face with Jesus at the end of my life is just the epitome to keep you going. And like Paul, I look forward with the joy of following Jesus. And it's not always easy sometimes. And sometimes it seems very hard and things seem to get in the way so easily. But Jesus keeps me going. Knowing he's there with me every step of the way makes it bearable at times and really good at others. I love this book of Philippians, I really do. And I suggest you go home and just read that first chapter again when you get home today. It's so full of encouragement. It's so full of hope. And it's so full of joy. And joy is the quiet confidence assurance of God's love and work in our lives. And his promise that he will be there no matter what happens to us. Philippians is Paul's joy letter. The church in the Macedonian city had been a great encouragement to Paul. The Philippian believers had enjoyed a very special relationship with him, so he wrote them this personal expression of his love and affection. Chapter 4, verse 1 emphasizes it. It says, they had brought him great joy. And Philippians is also a joyful book because it emphasizes the real joy of Christian life. The concept of rejoicing or joy appears 16 times in these 4 chapters. It's only 4 chapters in the whole book. And it says the pages radiate this positive message, culminating in the exhortation at the end to rejoice in the Lord always. I will say again, rejoice. And in a life dedicated to serving Christ, Paul had faced excruciating poverty, abundant wealth, and everything in between. He even wrote this joyful letter when he was in prison. And whatever the circumstances, Paul had learned to be content, finding real joy as he focused all his attention and energy on knowing Christ and obeying him. On Paul's first missionary journey, he visited towns close to his headquarters in Antioch in Syria. But on his second and third journeys, he travelled even further. And because of the great distances between the congregations that Paul had founded, he could no longer oversee them all. So he was compelled to write letters to teach and encourage the believers. Unfortunately, Paul had a staff of volunteers, including Timothy, Mark, and Epaphras, who personally delivered these letters and often remained with the congregations for a while to teach and encourage them. So I'm going to turn to page 1178 and see what we can hear and what we can learn from chapter 1 and how we can find real joy even in the most difficult circumstances. And when we look at verse 4, we have our first challenge today when he says that in my prayers for all of you, I always pray with joy because of your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now. Why do I see that as a challenge to us? Well, if someone wrote and said that they were praying for us as a church, would they be praying with joy? Are we seen as a beacon of love and joy in this village? Or do most people see no difference in us to those with no belief? At this time in our country's life, I think there's a real need for the joy of knowing Jesus should be shared more and more with our family, friends and neighbours. Or sadly, are we so caught up in the gloom and the doom in the papers and the TV news that there seems to be little joy in our lives at this time? You see, Paul recognised that the Philippians, by helping him, were also helping Christ's cause. And the Philippians were ready to be used by God for whatever he wanted them to do. And then when others think about us, what comes to their minds? Are we remembered with joy by them? Do our act of kindness lift up others? I hope so, because God sees and hears everything that we do and knows the true motive in our hearts. As my apron said, it's not easy being a Christian. Now moving on, when Paul said that the Philippians were partners in the gospel, he was pointing out their valuable contribution in spreading God's message. They contributed through their practical help when Paul was in Philippi and through their financial support when he was in prison. And as today, as we help our ministers, missionaries and evangelists through prayer, hospitality and financial donations, we become partners with them. How much of a partner do you feel in spreading the gospel? How generous are you in your giving to help this church grow? I know that money is tight for many of us, and we've got bills to pay, but so is the church. In its building, its mission work, and just the day-to-day expenses we need to pay to support all who work here. I'm going to challenge you to think about whether you've reviewed your giving in the last year or two, because in another of his letters to the church in Corinth, Paul says, the point is this: the one who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and the one who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. Each of you must give as you've made up your mind, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to provide you with every blessing in abundance, so that by always having enough of everything, you may share abundantly in every good work. That's in 2 Corinthians verse 6 onwards. And here he was exhorting them to keep their promise to help the church in Jerusalem, who were going through a famine. Now, if we really want our church to grow, then like the Philippians, we need to be generous and joyful in our giving. And let's give all we can, not because we have to, but because we want to help. Remember, God loves a cheerful giver. Then my second point today is not a challenge, but an encouragement to keep going. In verses 1 to 6, I love it because Paul tells us that God, who began a good work in us throughout our lifetime, will finish it when we meet him face to face. God's work for us began when Christ died on the cross in our place. His work in us began the day when we first believed. Now the Holy Spirit lives in us, enabling us to be more like Christ every day. And Paul is describing the process of Christian growth and maturity that began when we accepted Jesus and continues until Christ returns. However, maybe you feel you're not making enough progress in your spiritual life. Please be assured that when God starts a project, he completes it. As with the Philippians, God will help you grow in grace until he's completed his work in your life. So when you get discouraged, remember that God will not give up on you. He promises to finish the work he's begun. When you feel incomplete, unfinished, or distressed by your shortcomings, remember God's promise and provision. Do not let your present condition rob you of the joy of knowing Jesus or keep you from growing closer to him. And if you really feel you're stuck, then talk to one of the ministry team and let's explore ways that will help you to move on and forward in faith and joy. Because like Paul, I want all of us to grow together in love and charity with all Christians so that we can pass on the good news of Jesus to people around us. Like Paul, do you look back on different times in your life, and as he wanted to see the people of Philippi who helped and supported him, do we also look back to church leaders and members who once influenced us as well? Look back on those times with gratitude, yes, but like Paul, look forward to what lies ahead of us as well. If you look round this church at the banners up, depicting all the years since it all began, think of all the changes that have gone on in those years. Cranmer, which we're using today, wrote his services in 1665 for the time of 1665, and he changed it 3 times before he was killed anyway. Then, it's the same with our services. We've evolved with different series. We've had Series 1, Series 2, Series 3, ASB, then Common Prayer. Now we're trying Open Door at 9 o'clock. Different ways of service. And I bet at each one, people have shouted and screamed when they've tried to change them. Because that's us as people. We like things that are comfortable. We like things that we're sure of. But there are times sometimes we need to move on. We have to show people that the church can evolve and change as society around us changes as well. There needs to be ways for Christians to be in touch and encourage all those around them, not just looking back on the past, but supporting and loving those around us now as well. And remember, unless we can bring new blood into our church, then this church will not be the vibrant, joyful centre of the village in possibly 10 years' time, or definitely in 20. When I first walked into this church several years ago now, I was greeted with warmth and, yes, with joy as well. I hope that new visitors today will find the same joy and love that I did. And it will only happen if we all work hard together, encouraging each other and praying for each other, not just in the hard times, but in the good times as well. You see, Paul used every opportunity to teach the gospel of Jesus and to spread the good news. He could easily have sat back when he was in prison and sulked. Never. He used every opportunity to share the love and joy of knowing Jesus in his life. Can you imagine what it was like for those guards who were guarding him for several hours at a time? They were possibly chained to him to make certain he could not escape. They were almost certainly in the same room and heard him preach, explain, dictate his letters, talk to his friends, and share the gospel in every way possible. He didn't sit and give up because he was in prison. Instead, he made every opportunity to share in the love he had for Jesus and the joy of knowing him. I wonder how many of those soldiers were converted. I wonder how many of them began to follow Jesus as well. I think it would have been very difficult not to listen and take the message in for themselves. I hope that we can all use the opportunities that we have. Or do you hold back at times so people will not think we're trying to ram our faith down their throats? Sadly, I know there are times when I've let opportunities get missed. And this sermon challenged me as I wrote it, so I'm not going to apologise if it's challenging you as you listen to it. We're told that we should encourage other Christians, but there may be times when we're not happy with the ways others are preaching and teaching. Now we see that Paul reacts very selflessly to those who were seen as preaching to further their own ambitions. They were seen to be taking advantage of Paul's imprisonment to make a name for themselves. He said that regardless of their motives, he rejoices that the gospel is being preached. It's never easy to get up, to preach, to teach, and to teach the gospel of Christ especially. And when we do, there may be some who do not agree with our message or the way we preach, and they may tell us something in a way that hurts. Whatever we do, let us do it in love, pray about it and reflect on it, because something said quickly cannot be taken back. Sadly too, there are times when we may think there are some Christians who seem to care for the wrong reasons, but like Paul, we're not to judge. He wouldn't condemn them, so neither should we. However, on the other hand, he also reminded us that God would not excuse their motives. Therefore, it's not for us to judge what other Christians are doing. Rather, we should be glad if God uses their message, regardless of their motives and our feelings. Paul's whole purpose in life was to speak out boldly for Christ and to become more like him. Now, for those who do not believe in God, this life on earth is all that there is. And so it's natural for them to strive for this world's purposes and values: money, popularity, power, pleasure, and prestige. For Paul, however, to live meant to develop eternal values and to tell others about Christ, who alone could help them see life from an eternal perspective. I remember years and years ago watching Michael Parkinson on one of his shows, interviewing Cliff Richard. And of course he challenged him about his faith. And Cliff said what he believed. And Michael said, "Supposing you're wrong though, and at the end of your life that's it, there's nothing else." And Cliff said, "Okay, but I would have lived a much better life because of my faith." And Michael Parkinson had to agree. I do feel sorry for these people who think that this life is all that there is. Then there are others who seem to think we can all live as we like down here on earth, and if they're all good, they're all going to go to heaven. We're going to live there eventually and live happily ever after. They've got no time for God whilst they're here on earth, but somehow seem to think that this heavenly place where we all get together, we're going to all be there together afterwards. Paul tells us that he could confidently say, although life with Christ on earth was good, dying would be even better than living, because in death he would be removed from all worldly troubles and he would get to see Christ face to face. And I say this encourages me so much and makes all that happens here on earth so worthwhile. The knowledge that one day I'm going to get to see Christ face to face. As a Christian, it means that life on earth is good, because as it said on my apron, the retirement plan is amazing. There's no fear of death. So finally, Paul considered it a privilege to suffer for Christ. In this country, we rarely suffer physically for our faith, so that we do not by nature considering suffering to be a privilege. Yet sadly, there are times when we suffer, usually emotionally, if not physically, when we faithfully represent Christ. Then our message and example can affect us and others for good. When we suffer for our faith, it doesn't mean we've done something wrong. In fact, the opposite is usually true. It verifies that we've been faithful. We need to use suffering to build up our character and not resent it or let us tear it down. Throughout his life, Paul suffered for spreading the gospel, and he was strong enough and brave enough to continue. Like the Philippians, we're also in conflict with anyone who would do anything to discredit the saving message of Christ. I believe that all true believers need to be in this fight together, uniting against the same enemy for a common cause. Why do we argue between ourselves when there are plenty of people outside the church who are more than willing to put us down? We need to support and strengthen each other, not join in and knock each other. Paul had a really strong purpose when he served the Philippians and other Christians as well in other churches. And we also need that same purpose for living that goes beyond providing for our own physical needs. How can we help others on their Christian journey? Whom can we serve and help? What is our purpose for living? Do we do it wholeheartedly as Paul? Or are we half-hearted because we don't like to stand out from others around us? Are we joyful in and willing in our service, or half-hearted, especially when it might call for some sacrifice on our time, our money, and our talents? Let's be willing to stand up for Jesus, loving him as we do it. Let's be willing to build each other up in love and joy and stand alongside our brothers and sisters, especially when they're suffering and times are hard. So that Paul, we can say together, rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. Amen.